set the timer because I know I heard you really like to have your break around 8 o'clock, right? So. You know, John and Stu, you did a great job. You set me up really well. You did kind of the heavy lifting for me. So I think I'm going to have some fun tonight. And you're going to help me. But first, let me try to tie some of the things that John and Stu have put together, put up on this board. Well, I don't have a very deep knowledge of history. Sorry, the history majors here. But one thing I do know about the history of transportation in Iowa is Thomas McDonald is the man who John mentioned about. He started in Iowa, and he was the first leader of the Bureau of Public Roads in Washington. He actually held that post for several decades. And he was a bachelor. And that's important because when the interstate highway system came up, he was actually opposed to it. And he somewhat lost his job over the opposition to the interstate highway system. And guess what he did on the day he left office? He took out the door with his secretary and they got married. What a different day, right? Well, anyway, the other thing here in Iowa, we are the first states to actually use steel reinforcement in our bridges. We have the first steel reinforced bridge, and that plays better to an audience of civil engineers, but you know, that is something that we are proud of. And then kind of to take off, I'll get to Stu's comments in a minute, but you know, Professor started the session tonight by explaining what he did today when it comes to transportation. Let me paint you a picture of what my life has been since I got up this morning and what it will be for the next 12 hours. And it's focused around transportation. I got up, I took the bus downtown, I transferred downtown, and I went to the rental agency at the airport. I picked up a car, I drove to Ames. I drove back. I taught 3 classes. I'm standing here. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, or wait, I leave here, I drive to Chicago. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I got on a plane and I go to Washington, D.C. Now, where else other than the United States that we can pull this off without a blink of an eye? We have a major transportation system here in the United States. We can quibble about, is it the right system? Does it need to be changed? Yes, it does as things modernize. But we do have a good system, and it's a major part of our economic system here. Even though Professor Fuller showed we have a D minus in highways?
D minus.
D minus. Well, at least, you know, on my way here, I heard a bunch of students all talking about what midterms they just finished and how many more they have left. No midterms here tonight, but I do get to test your memory on some things they showed before. So we have a D minus on highways, and we have a D in transit side of things. And a D minus comes by, we have a lot of congestion. Not here in Iowa City. You know, our congestion is what, 15 minutes, and it's mostly on Riverside Drive by the Veterans Hospital at 5:15, right? But there's other states, other metropolitan areas that are concerned about congestion, and one of the things that they're concerned about is how do we reduce congestion? We can look at it through transportation demand measures, try to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled, but we can't ignore the fact that we still need to fund existing systems and perhaps expansions of our systems. So that gets back to, well, how do we do that? Stu put up a list of different ways that here in the state of Iowa we've looked at how to increase the amount of revenue coming into supporting all our transportation, all our surface transportation systems. Right? So roads and transit. And John did the same, he has other things. So what I want to do tonight is kind of look at the policy implications of how do we raise those fees. I like the politician in me. I like to say fees rather than taxes because a whole lot of the political spin on this is if you say the word tax, that's a dirty word. We don't like saying that. But a fee is much better because it ties something to a use. So I'll get to that with this next slide. But here's where the first audience participation comes in. And Stu, you plug your ears because I think you heard this from me way too many times. But John put up on the board the cost of owning and operating a vehicle here in the United States for last year, 2008, was about $8,000. Right? That's the typical household. That's how much you're paying for owning and operating a single vehicle. And if you didn't pay attention, or it just was blurry up here, you would see that part of that is fuel cost. And you know, if you drive the average vehicle, which is getting 24 miles per gallon, the average distance that we drive here in the United States, which is about 1,200 miles per year, you purchase about 500 gallons of fuel each year. And John had a slide up there that was about $2,000 in fuel costs alone. So here's, finally, I get to see who's going to participate. It's going to be everybody in the back row, I bet. So out of that, about $2,000 you spend on fuel. How much do you spend in fuel taxes? How much do you pay for supporting our road system, for supporting transit system? There's one thing they didn't mention, maybe not as clearly as some other people would have. 86% of that highway trust fund goes to the road system. The others go to supporting transit in other areas. So it's not that you're just spending and paying for the roads, you're supporting other surface transportation systems with that. So let me get back to that. How much do you pay? Anybody? Well, how about if I ask you this? John already said the federal fuel tax is at 18.4 cents. And it has been there for since 1993. How much do we pay here in the state of Iowa? So every time you fill up your tank for gasoline, and I'll make it easier, it's the straight gasoline, not an ethanol blend. How much do you pay per gallon? John. It's usually a John because they look up. It's 20 cents. Well, actually 22 cents. Averaging together 20, 21 cents. Where does that put us with the rest of the nation? We're right in the middle. So the federal and the states combined tax is about 40 cents per gallon. And by the way, how much do you pay each year for that privilege of driving the vehicle? It turns out to be less than $250 per year. That's less than $25 per month. And let me ask you, how much do you pay for your cable? So think about the relative cost, revenue that you face. Well, yeah, again, you might have more fun watching TV than driving. But here's what the reality we're facing in the United States right now. Both Stu and John talked about the Highway Trust Fund. This is the remaining balance in the Highway Trust Fund after the expenditures at the end of each month. So right up there on the screen, you have 2006 and 2007, and you see that by the end of the year, we ended up around $8 billion in the trust fund. Well, that was going well until we hit 2008. What happened in 2008? Remember our $4 per gallon fuel? That really cut back on how many miles we drove. That fed into the perfect storm Stu was talking about, where you had a rapid increase in expenditures, a lot to do with construction costs, and a lot of us were not driving as much, so less revenue was coming in. So what happened? We looked at the August, a huge influx of money from the United States Treasury, $8 billion of a transfer from general tax revenue. Nothing to do with the use of the transportation system. It's your and my income tax, pretty much, the corporate tax that goes into that general fund. Was 2009 any better? Slightly. But again, what happened? We got to the summer, and the forecast was saying the road use fund was going to be bankrupt by the end of the year. Why does that matter? Just as Stu said, last week when the Federal Highway Administration had it closed down, all funding stopped for construction and maintenance of the road system. Actually, I kind of benefited from that because one of my project reports needed to be in Washington on your desk on March 1st, and it happened to be the day the federal highway employees were all furloughed. So I got a 2-day break. And Stu just mentioned that what we're looking at in this coming year isn't an 8 billion or a 10 or 7 billion influx of general funds. It's 20 billion. Again, just to keep our system pretty much at its status quo. As I mentioned, why are these things occurring? We've seen a reduction in VMT. And again, you could think of this as a good thing. Good thing for other federal policies. We reduced the amount of VMT, the amount of miles we drive. Right? But it has an impact on how we generate those revenues. Oh, by the way, I didn't bring this out all the way, but you know that in 2008 to 2009, that was the first year in American history that the rate of increase in VMT was not positive. We actually had a decrease in the number of vehicle miles we traveled in 2008 compared to 2007. And put that, you weren't paying attention to that slide yet, were you? So here's another thing that adds to that perfect storm. If I was standing here in 1979, I would be saying with a big smile on my face, you know, my car's getting 8 miles per gallon. That's good. That's the average that the cars were getting in 30 years ago. What is it today? Anybody? There's got to be a Mary here somewhere. Mary? 24 miles per gallon. Drastic increase in fuel efficiency. We haven't seen that the fuel taxes have kept up with that. Now, I'm saying that's a good thing because think about the negative externalities of driving. Air pollution. We reduce the amount of fuel we burn by having higher efficient vehicles. We reduce the amount of emissions going into our air. That's my first time on here. So that's good. Good for the national policy. Reduction in VMT, increase in fuel efficiency. Also good for federal policy of fuel or limiting our dependence on foreign oil. Energy independence. Great. But not so good for how we're paying for the roads. Okay, so our funding options. Now, over on the left-hand side, what I listed are the typical ways that we are funding our road system and our transit system. Now here's another one of these trivia questions that you can take home during spring break and impress people maybe. On the average transit system here in the United States, how much of the cost is covered by the fares? So, right? We go out, you get onto the Iowa City bus, you drop in 75 cents. On average, that's only covering 30% of the cost of the transit system. The other 70% comes through subsidies, transfers of money, a lot from the road use funds to cover that transit side of things. So we're taking care of transit as well as roads. But we look at fuel taxes, registration fees. I forgot to put up the title fees. That's what we looked at here in the state of Iowa. Registration fees and title fees are what's kind of carry the day for increasing the funds. What we don't do here in Iowa, at least not right now, is charge tolls on our roads. We could drive on every state road in the state here and you don't pay a toll. Other states, like our neighbor Illinois, does. They use part of that money, again, to refinance the road system and support other transit systems. John mentioned congestion tolling. The idea of congestion tolling is to set a price based on how much that road is being used. The more you add to congestion, the more you pay for it. So again, it's this tied to a user pay principle. You use the roads during a peak congested period, you're going to pay more for that. It makes somebody decide, should I travel then, or should I travel on a different period of the day, or do I not make that trip, or do I take transit? Right? So it affects behavior. But again, it's a user-based. Mileage fees, the VMT fee. Instead of charging based on the amount of fuel you burn, you charge based on the number of miles you drive. Okay? So it goes away from that tied to fuel efficiency. Hold those negative thoughts for a moment. We also look at fare increases, right? Direct user fare increases on the transit side. Now these again are tied to when we use the system, we're paying for the system. On the right-hand side, we have other finance mechanisms that are being used and are increasingly being used. Property tax on a local level, property tax funds support for the transportation system. Some estimates show that on a municipal level, up to 24% of the local budget is spent and financed by property tax is spent on transportation. Okay, so that's the high end is when you include the effects of the police policing the transportation system itself. The other one is general sales tax. Now here in the state of Iowa, we might have gotten used to the local option sales tax. Last year one passed about the school financing. We'll just add another penny to the dollar, and that money is going to be used for increasing the education. Other states have looked at that to finance the transportation systems themselves. California is a great example. Now, again, let me point out that this is not a user-based fee. It has no connection, no direct connection to who uses the road or how much you use the road or how much you use the transit system. And then the last one is the general revenue, the income tax. You know, what Congress has now kind of put their toe in the water and say, hey, maybe we should move away from a user-based fee and tie it to a general revenue fee. Right? For you who are economists in the audience, you're probably, hopefully a little bit bristling on that when you start looking at disconnecting the source of revenue from those who use the revenue, who generate the revenue. Efficiency concerns come up. So let me just try to tie this up in a bit and maybe leave a lot of things out there for you to start asking questions about. Not to me, to the other panelists when they come up. But I'm going to base this off a very recent paper that was published by one of our colleagues out in California, Brian Taylor and Alexandra Norton. And what they did was they looked at why is different people in the sense of policymakers, decision makers, the general public, the end users of the system, why do we sometimes talk past one another when it comes to explaining why we should have fare increases, why should we have fuel tax increases, and looking at distributive justice. Now, I'm guaranteeing probably everybody in this room has at some point studied distributive justice, the idea of how do you allocate finite and scarce resources among a population. Right? So Brian and Alexandra took a stab at that related to transportation. Now, before I get to that, let me just set the context and put some things in your mind about what are we talking about when it comes to fare increases, in this case, transit fare. Connecticut, well, I won't tell you, we'll hopefully listen to it.
because the state is getting a lot less money from the gas tax than it used to. That's because people are driving less. With less gas tax money, the state's transportation fund is running low. The Democratic legislature suggested highway tolls to fix the problem. That didn't go over so well, so the governor is suggesting these bus and train fare hikes. So Democrats and Democrat lawmakers, rather, as well as some advocates for my transit for the environment, are going to be right here later on this afternoon to protest that idea. One other solution: increase the gasoline tax by a penny a gallon. And also might not prove to be very popular. By the way, I think there's
Okay, so what do you think the protesters had to say about that proposed fare increase? Now again, think about all the transit or the funding opportunities that we already have. Increase the fuel tax, increase the property tax, increase registration fees, increase sales tax. Let's listen to how they couch, in this case, just specifically on transit in Connecticut.
And I'm Sarah Welch and had the night off. The big budget battle came to the meeting today, specifically the bus stop at Chapel Street.
Democratic leaders going around the state trying to demonstrate how the governor's budget plan first goes, and these things will afford it. Decap reports on Mark Davis was flying anyway, not in details. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Ted. Have a seat there. Good evening, Ted. Good evening, everyone. From New Haven tonight. The governor says that she doesn't want to raise taxes. However, the Democrats are pointing out that the proposed hefty hike in bus and train fares is just like a big tax hike for thousands of people. For thousands of Connecticut residents, taking the bus is an essential state service, a way to get to work. For many, it's the only way to get around. So the news that the governor is proposing a fare hike of as much as 40% cuts real deep.
The economy is bad right now, and most people don't have what you did. Right? That's just plain and simple. It's more than I can get, you know what I mean? I don't think we should do it. It's already tough out here enough. In my opinion, we shouldn't even do it.
And for those looking for a job, it could be a make it or break it proposition.
We don't have money. I don't have a job.
Would you be able to afford an extra 50 cents for every trip?
No. I can barely afford a job.
That's why Democrats, led by Speaker of the House Chris Dunn, came to the Hague Agreement to demonstrate that the governor's way to solve the budget crisis hurts those least able to afford it. New Haven State Representative Cam States is one of the lawmakers who has been in on the negotiations with the governor.
It's the same as a tax increase. You just tax people who take advantage of certain services. At the lower end of the economic spectrum, I mean, the buses are largely attended by people at the low end of the economic spectrum.
The Democrats say this is a much bigger burden on many than the high-end income tax hike they are proposing. The governor today was at a small museum in Danville, urging people to visit state attractions this summer. She says hiking the bus fares was a fairness issue because she says when New York raised train fares on Metro North, she thought she had to do the same thing coming in this direction, and the bus fares had been raised for some time.
We said, well, if we're doing it there, you simply can't afford other transportation. It is a 50 cent, I believe it's a 50 cent increase. But again, it was a fairness issue, so we should do it across the board.
The Democrats say that it is that kind of logic that proves that the governor is out of touch with average people. The $250 a year bus fare hike, and that's what it would amount to, is a lot bigger burden to someone who rides the bus than a $250 income tax hike to someone who makes over $250,000 a year. Live in the Haven, Mark Davis, here's Hanley.
Yeah, I took the time to actually show that. They're kind of long clips, but I think it frames the issue that policymakers, decision makers face. Different groups are talking past one another in a lot of situations. So using this idea of, well, we're running out of time, so let me use these ideas that have been floated by Brian and Alexandra on the idea of how is it that different folks aren't seeing the same picture when it comes to the policy? Well, the three types of equality that was being mentioned in those videos was one, a market-based equality, where the allocation should be based on the willingness to pay. The other one is opportunity. We should provide that service, kind of a base level for everybody, But then those who could actually afford to pay for additional benefits should do that. And the third one is on the outcome basis, where let's just supply everything on an equal basis, and it doesn't matter about the needs or the wants of the people. Everybody gets an equal share. Okay. I bet if we had a little bit more time, we would go back and look at that video and pick out several comments that fall underneath each one of these ideas of equity. Now, to add to the complexity is that the unit of analysis changes. John and Stuart, they were talking about political jurisdictions. Right now, our federal funds are based on equality at the political jurisdiction. All states are treated the same. Right? Funding allocation goes from the federal government back to the states. Some states are donors, some states are recipients. Texas gives away a whole lot of money compared to Hawaii. The example from that paper was from 1956 to present, Texas has given away $2.2 billion in highway trust fund. Hawaii has received a similar amount. Right? The idea of, well, we treat political jurisdictions very similar to one another, kind of based in the form of our government. The other, what you heard in the video, are people who were talking about group identity. I'm a transit rider. Transit riders shouldn't be taking the burden of paying for mass transit because of the positive externalities of transit compared to ridership. And then the last one is the individual, whether it's the resident or the taxpayer. And again, just to point out, if you had some time to go back to look at that video, you saw all those perspectives, and they were all going past one another. What did the governor say? A 50-cent fare increase. Not a big deal. Who was she missing on this one? Or does it make sense from her perspective as the political jurisdiction? Okay, so the funding options, again, what I was going to conclude with this is just to take a look, or this time, just challenge you to take a look at each one of these funding mechanisms and try to explain to yourself or explain to somebody, where's the equity issues here? What's fair and what's not fair? Is it charging the end user more fair than charging everybody who pays sales tax? Is it or isn't it? Well, just as where I'm going to step off this bus is to say, for 100 years, we were looking at this. Currently, we're moving, especially in larger metropolitan areas, to this set. And right now, we're really coming very dependent on, or possibly very dependent on, these non-user-based fees to fund our transportation systems. Is it right or is it wrong? That's what you guys get to figure out. So with that, I'm close to keeping my promise. I'm only 5 minutes over, so thanks for listening.